Have you ever wondered if you are doing the right thing with your life? This is how Blaise felt, a doctor who had everything: respect, a successful career, patients who trusted him, and yet something was missing. His story is not just that of another saint on the calendar, but of a real man who dared to listen to that inner voice, telling him that something greater was waiting for him. Today, when we bless our throats every February 3rd, few know that behind this tradition lies a story of courage, overcome doubts, and a love so great that it led him to give his life for what he believed in. Chapter 1. The Doctor of Sebaste. Dr. Blaise, Dr. Blaise. The cries of children echoed in the streets as the doctor walked to his office. Some ran alongside him, others greeted him from the windows. To them, he was more than a doctor. He was the man who always had a smile and a candy tucked into his tunic pockets alongside his medical instruments. "My mother says he has blessed hands," one girl commented to another as they watched him pass. And rightly so. Blaise had that special way of treating his patients that went beyond medicine. When someone entered his office scared by a fever or pain, they left not only with a remedy, but with the certainty that everything would be all right. His day began before dawn, when he went out to gather medicinal herbs in the nearby hills. He loved that moment of solitude, the morning dew on his feet, the first ray of sunlight peeking through the mountains. It was during these moments that his thoughts flew beyond prescriptions and diagnoses. "Is this all I am?" he wondered as he stored thyme and chamomile in his bag. The answer began to come in unexpected ways. Like that time an elderly woman, after he cured her persistent cough, said to him, "Son, your hands heal because your heart listens." Or when a child, recovering from a high fever, asked him, "Is it true that God tells you how to heal us?" These words stayed with him, resonating in his mind during lonely nights. Little by little, Blaise began to notice that his best healings occurred when, in addition to applying his medical knowledge, he stopped to pray silently. It was something he didn't discuss with anyone, but he was increasingly aware of a presence guiding him, whispering in his ear that something greater was waiting for him. Medicine was no longer enough to quench his thirst for something deeper, something he couldn't even name yet. Chapter 2. The Divine Call. Everything changed that stormy night. A desperate mother was knocking on his door. Her son couldn't breathe. Blaise ran through the rain to the little boy's house, but upon arriving, he realized his medical knowledge wouldn't be enough. The child was turning blue, choking. Without thinking, Blaise did something he had never done before. He knelt beside the bed and prayed out loud, asking for help from the God he was just beginning to know. What happened next would change his life forever. His hands, guided by a force he couldn't explain, moved precisely over the boy's throat. Within seconds, the little one began to breathe normally. The mother cried with joy, but Blaise was paralyzed, aware that he had just experienced something beyond medicine. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. The news of the miracle spread through Sebaste like wildfire in a dry field. People began to look at him differently. Some even knelt in his path. But Blaise felt more lost than ever. He knew he couldn't continue as before, that moment had been a sign he couldn't ignore. It was then that he decided to seek baptism. The ceremony was simple, but for Blaise, it was as if the entire world was transformed. The water falling on his head washed away years of doubts and unanswered questions. For the first time in his life, he felt he had found his true purpose. Medicine would no longer be just his profession, but his way of serving God. His office became a place where faith and science met. While treating his patients' bodies, Blaise learned to care for their souls as well. His diagnoses were accompanied by words of comfort and hope, and his treatments included both medicines and prayers. People began to say that in his office not only were illnesses cured, but peace was found. Chapter 3. Retreat to Mount Argio. The decision was not easy. Every morning as he opened his office, Blaise saw the hopeful faces of those seeking his help. How could I abandon them? He wondered. But that inner voice, The same one that had guided him so far was growing stronger. Mount Argeo, standing majestically on the horizon, seemed to call him like a magnet. "Are you leaving? Are you abandoning us?" his patients asked as the news began to spread. Blaise tried to explain that it wasn't a definitive goodbye, that he needed this time of solitude to be a better servant of God and of themselves. Some understood, others did not. An elderly woman, however, surprised him when she said, "Go, son. Sometimes you have to lose yourself to find yourself." His arrival at Mount Argeo was like entering another world. The bustle of the city was left behind, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the trees and the singing of birds. His first night in the cave he chose as a refuge was a mix of peace and fear. Shadows danced on the rocky walls, and the silence was so deep he could hear the beating of his own heart. Days became a sacred routine. At dawn, he gathered medicinal herbs, not for his patients, but as an act of communion with creation. Afternoons were spent in prayer, and he discovered that the forest animals approached without fear, as if recognizing a special presence in him. A wounded wolf was his first patient on the mountain, and soon the villagers of nearby hamlets began to speak of the saint of the mountain who healed both beasts and men. But not everything was peaceful in his retreat. Nights brought internal struggles, doubts that assailed him in the darkness. Am I doing the right thing? Wouldn't I be more useful in the city? However, every morning, as he watched the rising sun illuminate the valley, he felt a renewed certainty. In this secluded place, he was learning lessons that no medical book could teach him: patience, silence, deep listening to God's voice. Chapter 4. The Gift of Healing. Blaise's fame as a healer grew unexpectedly during his time on Mount Argeo. He was no longer just the doctor of Saint Blaise, but a man of God whose prayers seemed to have special power. People began to make the arduous journey up the mountain, seeking not only physical healing but also for their souls. "It's as if his hands have their own light," said the pilgrims who returned healed. One particularly cold morning, a woman arrived carrying her small son. The child could barely breathe. A fishbone had deeply lodged in his throat. The mother's eyes were filled with tears when she found Blaise gathering herbs near his cave. "Please," she begged, "he's my only son." Without hesitation, he placed his hands on the boy's throat and raised a prayer to heaven. In seconds, the bone came out, and the child could breathe normally. This miracle, which would later become the most well-known of his wonders, was just one of many occurring on that sacred mountain. Wild animals became his most faithful companions. One day, a mother bear arrived limping to his cave, followed by her hungry cubs. Blaise felt no fear. With the same gentleness he showed to his human patients, he examined the animal's injured paw and healed it. "Go in peace," he said softly, and the bear bowed her head as if she understood. Since then, it was common to see the mountain's most feared beasts resting peacefully near his refuge, as if they had found a new Eden. The most extraordinary were not the physical healings, but the transformations experienced by those who visited him. People arriving burdened with bitterness and resentment, left with an inexplicable peace. "It's as if they've taken a weight off my soul," said an elderly man who had climbed the mountain full of grudges against his son. Feuding families reconciled after speaking with him. Blaise had discovered that the gift of healing went far beyond curing diseases. It was about restoring the human spirit. Among the pilgrims seeking his help were also wealthy and noble people from the region. Some tried to convince him to return to the city, offering him riches and comforts. "People need you down there," they said. But Blaise had found a greater treasure in his simple life of prayer and service. "True wealth," he responded with a serene smile, "is the peace that comes from doing God's will." And so, day after day, he continued his mission to heal bodies and souls on that mountain that had become his sanctuary. Chapter 5. The pastor of the village. News spread through the streets of Saint Blaise like the wind among the olive trees. The bishop had died. The city was not only losing its pastor, but also facing turbulent times where spiritual guidance was more needed than ever. Families gathered in squares and markets, and one name echoed in all conversations: the holy doctor of the mountain. The elders of the council met for entire days, debating who could guide the community in those difficult times. Many names were suggested, but every time someone mentioned Blaise, a reverent silence filled the room. Who better than him, who knew how to heal both bodies and souls? But he's in retirement, some argued, dedicated to prayer and penance. One clear spring morning, a procession began to climb Mount Argeo. They were representatives of the church and the people, determined to bring back the one they considered chosen by God. They found him in his cave, surrounded as always by gentle animals, a living image of the peace everyone yearned for their city. The city needs you, they told him. God calls you through his people. Blaise listened silently, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Sebaste lay like a promise. It wasn't an easy decision. His heart had grown accustomed to the mountain's solitude, the intimate dialogue with God. But he remembered Christ's words: "The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." His return to the city was a day of celebration, the streets filled with flowers and songs. During the ceremony of his consecration as bishop, while receiving the mitre and the staff, a white dove entered through a cathedral window and perched on his shoulder. For many, it was a sign from heaven. For Blaise, it was a reminder of his mission, to be an instrument of God's peace among his people. Chapter 6. The Life of Holiness. The new bishop transformed the life of Sebaste from the very first day. His episcopal residence, contrary to the customs of the time, was a simple house near the cathedral. "Christ was born in a manger," he replied when suggested to move to a palace. The doors were always open to everyone, especially the poorest and the needy. His days began before dawn, in the small chapel he had built in his house, a reminiscence of his cave on Mount Argeo. He spent hours in prayer before beginning his pastoral duties. Faithful who arrived early could see him kneeling before the altar, so still and serene that he seemed transported to another world. As bishop, he surprised everyone by maintaining his medical practice. "Christ was a doctor of bodies and souls," he said when some questioned if this activity was appropriate for his new dignity. He established a hospital next to the cathedral where the sick received not only medical care, but also spiritual comfort. His hands, which now blessed the bread and wine on the altar, continued to heal the sick with the same humility as always. His homilies attracted crowds. He did not use elaborate rhetoric nor cite famous philosophers. He spoke with the simplicity of someone who has contemplated truth face to face. He shared the lessons he had learned on the mountain, illustrating them with stories from everyday life that everyone could understand. Holiness, he taught, is not about doing extraordinary things, but about doing ordinary things with extraordinary love. Charity was the hallmark of his episcopate. He organized a system of aid for the poor that became a model for other dioceses. The church granaries were always open to the needy, and he established hospitals and shelters throughout the city. "The true wealth of a church," he often said, "is not measured by the gold of its chalices, but by the love in the hearts of its faithful." Chapter 7. The Protector of Throats. That winter afternoon would be etched in Sebaste's memory forever. A desperate woman burst into the cathedral during evening prayer, carrying her choking son. The little boy had been playing with his friends when a fishbone lodged in his throat, and now his face was turning blue from lack of air. Blaise immediately rose from the altar where he was praying. The crowd stepped aside, forming a corridor between the wooden pews as he approached the child. The silence in the cathedral was so deep that the crackling of candles could be heard. The mother, with tears in her eyes, placed her son in the arms of the holy bishop. With the same gentleness he had shown so many times before, Blaise placed his hands on the little boy's throat. He closed his eyes and raised a prayer to heaven, asking for the intercession of Christ the healer. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. The bone came out by itself, and the child began to breathe normally. The onlookers fell to their knees, aware that they had witnessed a miracle. News of this miraculous healing quickly spread beyond Sebastian's borders. Soon, people from all over began to arrive seeking Blais's blessing for their throat problems. The saint developed a special blessing, crossing 2 candles in the shape of an X over the faithful's throats while invoking divine protection. This special gift to heal throat illnesses became his distinctive mark, although he always insisted that it was God who healed. The crossed candles, he explained to his faithful, remind us of Christ's cross, from where all healing comes. And so, without seeking it, he became the protector of all those suffering from throat ailments. Chapter 8. Times of Persecution. The Roman Empire was experiencing tumultuous times. While in the West, Emperor Constantine had granted freedom to Christians, in the East, his brother-in-law Licinius, driven by jealousy and power, unleashed a new wave of persecution. News of martyred Christians reached Sebaste like raindrops before a storm. Blais watched the events with growing concern. In the city's catacombs, he prepared secret shelters to protect his flock. During the day, the cathedral functioned normally, but at night, in the silence, Christians dug tunnels and created hidden spaces. "We must be as prudent as serpents and as innocent as doves," he reminded his faithful. The city's prefect, eager to curry favor with Licinius, began seeking prominent Christians to make examples of them. The eyes of the informers naturally fell on Bishop Blais, whose reputation for holiness and miracles was impossible to hide. His followers begged him to flee, to return to his refuge on Mount Argeo, but he refused to abandon his flock. In the homilies of those days, his words took on a new sense of urgency. "Do not fear those who can kill the body," he preached, quoting the scriptures, "but fear the one who can destroy the soul." The community prepared for the inevitable, strengthening their faith in secret meetings and sharing the sacraments with renewed devotion. One cold morning, as Blais prayed in his chapel, soldiers surrounded his house. The clanging of their armor and the neighing of horses broke the morning's peace. The holy bishop did not attempt to escape or resist. He opened the door calmly, blessing the soldiers who came to arrest him. "Everything is in God's hands," he said serenely as they chained him. Chapter 9. The Arrest of the Saint. The path to prison became a silent procession. The inhabitants of Sebaste, awakened by the soldiers' noise, peered through their windows and doors, watching helplessly as their beloved bishop was taken away. Some women wept silently, while children clung to their mothers, not understanding why the man who had healed them so many times was being arrested. During the journey, something extraordinary happened. A woman made her way through the crowd, carrying her choking son with a fishbone lodged in his throat. "Please," she cried desperately, "my son is dying." The soldiers tried to push her away, but Blais, still chained, stopped. With a compassionate look, he raised a brief prayer and blessed the child. Instantly the bone came out and the little one could breathe. Even some soldiers made the sign of the cross, astonished. In prison he was locked in a damp, dark cell. The walls dripped with water and the cold seeped through the cracks. But Blais maintained the serenity that had always characterized him. The other prisoners, surprised by his presence, began to approach him. Soon, the cell became an improvised church where the holy bishop continued his ministry, consoling the afflicted and healing the sick. The jailer, a rough man named Marco, couldn't understand how that prisoner maintained such peace amidst suffering. Every time he brought him bread and water, he found Blais praying or helping other inmates. One night, when Marco's daughter fell gravely ill, the jailer, desperate, went to the saint's cell. "My daughter is dying," he whispered through tears. Blais prayed for the little girl, and the next day the girl was completely healed. Days in prison turned into weeks, but Blais's spirit remained unbroken. He transformed his captivity into a new form of ministry, bringing hope to that place of darkness. "Chains can bind the body," he told his fellow prisoners, but the spirit remains free when anchored in God. Chapter 10. The Testimony of Faith. Prefect Agricolau watched with frustration as Blas's reputation for holiness grew even inside prison. He decided to subject him to a public interrogation, hoping that fear would make him renounce his faith. In Sebast's main square, before a crowd restrained by soldiers, the trial of the holy bishop began. "Worship our gods," Agricolau demanded, "and you will be free. You can continue your work as a doctor helping people." Blas, standing before him, replied with a serene smile, "How could I worship stone gods when I know the living God? It is He who grants true freedom, not you." His words, spoken firmly but without arrogance, caused a murmur of admiration among the crowd. Furious at the response, the prefect ordered him to be whipped. The lashes tore his tunic and flesh, but from Blas's lips only prayers came. "Father, forgive them because they do not know what they are doing," he repeated with each blow. Witnesses say his face shone with a supernatural light, and some of the executioners had to turn away, unable to bear that manifestation of holiness. After the torture, they returned him to his cell, hoping that the pain and isolation would break his will. But the opposite happened. The other prisoners, moved by his testimony, began to ask for baptism. The water dripping from the prison walls turned into baptismal water, and the cell into a catacomb where faith flourished amidst darkness. One night, as Blas prayed in his cell, a bright light illuminated the prison. Witnesses claimed that Christ himself appeared to him, saying, "Do not fear, faithful servant. Your testimony will not be in vain." This vision filled him with indescribable joy and renewed strength to face what was to come. "If Christ is with me," he declared to his jailers, "who can be against me?" Chapter 11. The Martyrdom. The dawn of the fatal day arrived with a sky tinted red. The news had spread throughout Sebaste. Prefect Agricolau had decided to execute the holy bishop. The Christians, hidden among the crowd gathering in the square, prayed silently as they awaited their pastor's appearance. Some had spent the night in vigil, praying in the catacombs for strength for their beloved bishop. When Blas appeared, escorted by guards, a sepulchral silence fell over the square. His body bore the marks of torture, but his face radiated a supernatural peace. As he passed by a crying woman, he paused for a moment. "Do not cry for me," he said gently. "Cry for those who do not know God's love." The soldiers, impressed by his serenity, barely dared to push him. Agricolau, seated in his tribunal, offered one last chance. "Sacrifice the empire's gods, and you will live." Blas, looking at him with compassion, replied, "Your gods are the work of human hands. My God is the creator of heaven and earth, and to him alone I will serve, even if it costs me my life." His words, spoken firmly but without hatred, resonated in the silent square. The prefect, enraged by this final refusal, ordered immediate execution. As they led him to the place of torment, Blas did not stop blessing and comforting his people. Witnesses assure that when the executioner raised his sword, a bright light descended from heaven, and the saint's face was illuminated with celestial joy. His last words were a prayer for his flock. "Lord, take care of them, as you have taken care of me." The moment of martyrdom was etched in Sebasti's memory as a day of pain and glory. When the sword fell, they say a flock of white doves took flight from the square, and a sweet fragrance filled the air. The Christians, risking their lives, gathered his body during the night and buried him with honor, sure that his shed blood would be the seed of new believers. Chapter 12. The legacy of Saint Blaise. Blas's death did not mark the end, but the beginning of something new. His tomb quickly became a pilgrimage site, where the faithful came seeking comfort and healing. Miracles did not cease with his death. On the contrary, they seemed to multiply. Particularly notable were the healings of throat illnesses, reminiscent of that first miracle with the choking child. Devotion to Saint Blaise spread like wildfire throughout the Christian empire. In churches, the tradition of blessing throats every February 3rd began, his feast day, using 2 crossed candles. This ritual, which started in Saint Blaise, was soon adopted by Christian communities everywhere, keeping alive the memory of the saint doctor and bishop who gave his life for the faith. His example of life inspired generations of Christians. Doctors took him as their patron, seeing in him a model of how to unite science with faith. Church pastors found in his story an example of how to guide the flock in times of persecution. Even animal lovers adopted him as a protector, remembering his special connection with wild creatures during his retreat on Mount Argeo. The relics of Saint Blaise were venerated and distributed throughout Christendom. Each fragment carried the memory of his holiness and the power of his intercession. Churches were built in his honor in cities and towns, and his story was told over and over, inspiring the faithful to maintain their faith even in the most adverse circumstances. However, Saint Blaise's deepest legacy was not in monuments or relics, but in the way he lived, uniting science with faith, service with contemplation, firmness with compassion. His life demonstrated that holiness was not about performing great feats, but about living God's love in the ordinary and extraordinary circumstances of life. Chapter 13. The Blessing of Throats. Every February 3rd, in churches around the world, a beautiful and meaningful ritual is repeated. The faithful approach the altar where the priest, holding 2 blessed candles in the shape of a cross, gently touches their throats. The words of the blessing resonate with the same faith that moved Saint Blaise so many centuries ago. Through the intercession of Saint Blaise, bishop and martyr, may God free you from throat illnesses and all other evils. This tradition, which began in the streets of Saint Blaise, has become one of the most beloved sacramentals of the Church. The 2 crossed candles symbolize more than a simple blessing. They represent the intersection between the divine and the human, between medicine and faith that Saint Blaise embodied so perfectly in his life. Entire families come to receive this blessing, passing down from generation to generation the story of the saint doctor who became a bishop. Testimonies of healings attributed to this blessing fill entire books. A mother in Italy recounts how her son, after receiving the blessing, miraculously recovered from a severe throat infection. A singer in Spain attributes the recovery of his voice to the intercession of Saint Blaise. In Mexico, an entire family assures that the blessing protected them during a diphtheria epidemic. The ceremony itself is a moment of profound spiritual connection. The priest's gesture, crossing the candles over the faithful's throat, recreates that historic moment when Saint Blaise saved the choking child. The faithful approach with reverence, some touching medals or images of the saint, others whispering personal prayers. It is a moment where ancient faith becomes present and tangible. In many places, the blessing of throats has become a community celebration that goes beyond the religious ritual. Parishes organize festivals and fairs in honor of Saint Blaise, where healing stories are shared, foods are blessed, and acts of charity are performed, remembering the saint's spirit of service. It is a day that unites tradition with living faith, medicine with prayer, body with spirit. Chapter 14. Prayer to Saint Blaise. Glorious. Saint Blaise, doctor of bodies and souls, who knew how to unite science with faith, medicine with prayer, hear our supplications on this day. You who walked between the office and the altar, between the mountain and the city, teach us to find God in every moment of our lives. Holy protector of throats, who with your blessed hands saved that child from certain death, intercede for all who suffer from illnesses. May your blessing reach the doctors and nurses who, like you, dedicate their lives to caring for the sick. Protect especially children and all those who suffer from throat ailments. Brave martyr of Christ, who preferred death over denying your faith, grant us the strength to firmly uphold our convictions in a world that often opposes them. Help us to be, like you, brave witnesses of God's love, willing to serve others regardless of the cost. Holy Bishop of Sebaste, who knew how to guide your flock with wisdom and love, even in times of persecution, intercede for the Church and its pastors. May your example inspire today's priests and bishops to be true spiritual fathers, combining firmness in truth with tenderness in dealings. Friend of God's creatures, who found in nature a reflection of divine love, teach us to respect and care for creation. May your intercession help us to see in every living being the Creator's mark, and that, like you, we may know how to live in harmony with all creation. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Saint Blaise, pray for us.